Welcome back to Oliver Scholar's CEO Salon series with your host, Dr. Danielle R. Moss. On today's panel, we'll be discussing Latinx leadership in America, past, present, and future. Joining the conversation, help us welcome alumna Elizabeth Angeles, alumnus Jose Ortiz Jr., and Alicia Guevara. Let's talk.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this important and timely conversation. I'm so excited to be talking to these experts in the social sector about how we lift up and advance the leadership of Latinx leaders. And so just ready to jump into the conversation, get a cup of coffee or a cup of wine, whatever you need, sit at your computer, and let's dive right in. My first guest is Jose Ortiz, and Jose is an alum of the Oliver Scholars Program, and I'm going to invite him to come on and tell us a little bit about himself and what he's doing.
Hey, Danielle. It's great to be with you. Thanks so much for pulling this together and for obviously the invitation to participate in this incredible series. It's always great to be back with Oliver. I am Jose Ortiz Jr. I'm the CEO of the New York City Employment and Training Coalition, or NYCETC. We're the largest city-based workforce development association in the country. And we have 190 member organizations providing jobs for more than 500,000 New Yorkers. Our mission is to ensure that every New Yorker has access to the skills, training, and education needed to thrive in the local economy, and that every business is able to maintain a highly skilled workforce. And we're driven by two core values. We're focused on access and equity and market-driven talent development. And so it's really about ensuring that every New Yorker gains meaningful income and that we're building strong ties with the business community. And our work really is focused on, the most marginalized populations in New York City and across the state. And so, 90% of the workers that use these workforce development programs are Black, Asian, and Latinx or non-white workers. So it's a really timely discussion, and I'm excited to be here with you.
Thank you so much. Our next guest is Elizabeth Angeles, who is also an alum of the Oliver Scholars Organization.
Good evening. I'm so excited to see you, Danielle. Thank you for having me. And Jose Ortiz, a fellow alum. I am also a fellow alumna of the Oliver Scholars Program. I have admired the work that you have done in economic development, Jose, for a long time. And so really privileged and honored to be on this panel with you. I currently lead advocacy at the United Way of New York City, which is really focused on supporting low-income New Yorkers across the 5 boroughs. A lot of the work that we do is really focused on education and food security, and I help represent our organization across citywide and statewide coalitions and help uplift some of the learnings from our programs to influence state and local policy. So excited to be here tonight. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Last and certainly not least, but before I introduce her, I just want to lift up Elizabeth De Leon, who was scheduled to join us today and is obviously not going to be on the panel. She's actually having her Senate confirmation hearings for a high-level position in the Biden Department of Labor. So Elizabeth, we are sending you good vibes. I know you're going to knock this out the box. And we look forward to connecting with you once you have assumed your new role. And in the meantime, I want to introduce Alicia Guevara, who is the first woman and first Latina to lead Big Brothers Big Sisters of New York. Alicia, welcome, and tell us a little bit about what you're up to.
Thank you, Danielle. So wonderful to be able to share this space with you. Thank you for inviting me. And Elizabeth and Jose, glad to be with you here today. I'm the CEO of Big Brothers Big Sisters of New York City, which is the oldest youth mentoring organization in the country, the largest in the state of New York. And annually, we pair young people across the 5 boroughs of New York City with caring, compassionate adult mentors who take a stand for our young people and ignite potential so that they can really reach their greatest possible futures. We work with New Yorkers across the city, and we also work with corporations across industries who take a stand for young people by inviting them into their corporate corridors and helping them to explore career opportunities and really build social capital so that their access is expanded. And so really, really excited to be sharing the space with all of you this evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much for agreeing to be part of this conversation. So I would love to hear from all of you. How has your heritage and culture informed how you approach leadership? Anybody want to go first?
I'll take that one. It's really interesting. So I bet that this is not unique to being Latina or a member of the Latinx community, but it's my experience. We are an incredibly hospitable people. And so what you will experience when you come for a meeting with me is I've got a and this is of course pre-COVID when times were a little different, but I've got a fully stocked fridge. And before we start our meeting, I will offer you cafecito or water or seltzer, or would you like to break bread? And so there's this leveling that is incredibly important to me, not just culturally, but really really supports my leadership and ability to connect with people on a very human level. So that's certainly one. I think the other is our Latinx diaspora is so very different, right? Depending on your country of origin. And while we share tremendous commonalities, language, a legacy of colonialism and imperialism and racism and all of it, and a legacy of slavery in many of our lands, there are ways in which we're different too. And so my background is my parents are Cuban. And I think this is, in fact, pretty consistent across Cuban people. I grew up with this sense of there's nothing you can't do. There really isn't. This real belief that irrespective of every layer of my identity, there was just nothing that was insurmountable. And that sense of belief in self, which is so formative in my earliest stages, in my most formative years, I think really I attribute to my heritage and the way that it shaped what I envisioned to be possible.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Elizabeth, Jose, you want to say a little bit about that?
Sure, I can jump in. So much of what you said, Alicia, certainly resonates with me as well. My background is my mother is from Puerto Rico, my father's from the Dominican Republic. And I think a lot of, in terms of my upbringing, we grew up pretty humble family. I think that gratitude has been a big part of my leadership style and also my upbringing. And it comes from my heritage, really thinking about where we came from and knowing that there were people before me, including my parents, that sacrificed a lot and that we had a lot more, even with our humble background, that some people didn't have. And so I think having that sense of gratitude is reflective in my leadership style, really always putting forth the positive and trying to think about the wins in the current moment. I think that's generally important for advocacy as well, holding on to sort of like where we're making strides. And then I would also add, I think that my upbringing and heritage has influenced my sense of great responsibility. I think that, again, kind of knowing where my family was from, where my parents were from, what their lifestyle was, what their childhood was, made me feel a sense of great responsibility to really give back to others and have a good sense of community. And I think that shows up with my leadership as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's everything that both Alicia and Elizabeth have said, and I think also for me, my cultural experience is really everything to me. I feel like I define myself first and foremost after husband and father as a New Yorker, as somebody who is an Afro-Latino New Yorker, and someone who is just strongly connected to the city, and the diversity of the city and everything that I've experienced over the course of my life is really what drives me and has driven me to a career that is really mission driven and focused on economic and social justice. And so I fundamentally believe, that those pieces, if not for that, I'm not the person that I am today. I am someone who, seeks an entirely different path. And I think that my culture has been, like for many of us, it's been, an issue and a struggle at times, but it's also been an asset, for us as well, particularly for those of us who, were, excelled in school or were identified as, people who could qualify for programs like Oliver Scholars. And it's helped me really build, I think, a brand and a vision, along with so many others that have come before and so many others that will come after us. That I think that there is, Latino excellence, and there is Black excellence, and there's, there's a cultural excellence that exists here that I think other communities need to continue to see on a daily basis in order for them to, change their perception and value of who we are. And so, I start with that at the beginning of the day, and it's really what drives me home at the end.
So, one of the conversations that has gained momentum is this idea of culturally responsive leadership. I think BIPOC folks more broadly make up less than 16% of all nonprofit CEOs, for example. I can't remember the last time I went to an organization's website and there weren't lots of pictures of people who look like us. And oftentimes the leadership doesn't reflect that. And so it's not to say that you have to be BIPOC to effectively lead in other communities, but how important is being part of a culturally responsive leadership paradigm as you think about, these experiences that have shaped you? How do they impact decision making? And does it matter? Does culture even matter when you're at work?
Maybe I'll start with this one since I was the last one to go with the last one. I think it's incredibly important, and not to dismiss or to remove. There's incredible leaders across the sector that obviously are not from BIPOC communities. I feel that over the course of my lifetime, the majority of my mentors, in fact, have not been people of color. They've been leaders who have seen potential and have identified that and helped me flourish over the course of that time. And without that, I, again, would not be in the position that I am currently in today. But I would say that the significance that people of color bring to obviously leading social services and human service organizations is the lived experience, and it's not assumed. Obviously, there are obviously BIPOC communities that are coming from more affluent experiences and not necessarily indicative of the same experience that they're serving. But there is a connection there that I think is an unspoken connection as well that I think is incredibly vital and important, and one that, in order for us to move beyond just the permanent association that so many of our communities have with the needs that are and the services that are provided by social service communities, we need people to help to understand that arc. And help people build and lift out of these positions of poverty that we find ourselves in. I earlier this year was identified by the Robin Hood Foundation as a Power Fund grantee for that purpose, because of the fact that obviously there is a limited number of people of color leading organizations in New York City. And quite frankly, in a city as diverse as ours, it's actually worse than the national numbers. And so it's unfortunate. It's something that we need to do more on, and we need to identify leaders, and we need to identify emerging leaders, young people who are doing great work, continue to build them up, support them, and we can find ourselves in a future that is not a majority necessarily, but much more a reflection of the population that we're serving.
Great. Go ahead.
Yeah, if I may add, I think that the other piece of this, and Jose touched on so much, but the other piece of it is also making sure that leaders of color are not that cultural competency piece for us is important too. And part of that is realizing everything from how we communicate to how we address conflict and making sure it's responsive to the community you're serving. And I think that in the social sector and the public sector, which by nature is focused on service and service of communities, it is of utmost importance that we have leaders that are culturally competent. And you know, this ties back a little bit to my experience in Oliver Scholars. And I think back to small things, right? Like making eye contact, right? In some cultures, making eye contact is disrespectful, and others, it's about confidence, right? And when I think about Oliver Scholars and cultural competency, I connect to the idea of, as a young person, respectfully disagreeing with an elder or with someone in a leadership capacity, my teacher or a boss, was definitely something that I thought would be disrespectful. But in Oliver, and when you go to independent school and college, I learned actually learning how to professionally, respectfully disagree is actually really important in some spaces. And so when we think about cultivating leaders and leaders who can manage a team, leaders and managers who are aware of these kind of cultural differences and can cultivate folks so that they can grow and thrive in certain spaces, I think is incredibly important.
Just to add on to what's already been said, you know, it's essential. It's absolutely essential. Most public and nonprofit organizations are focused on helping communities, their particular audience, to become self-realized. And in those moments, representation matters. It matters tremendously in order to illustrate and create the possibilities of success, which ought to be the standard and not the exception, right? They really need to be the expectation. But in order to do that, we need to ensure that that representation is visible. And I want to be really clear. I'm not suggesting tokenism. I'm not suggesting one role or the other, but truly talking about systemic change in nonprofit organizations that create infrastructure so that people can grow, so that we can invest in our future leaders, so that we can develop our future leaders such that, to your point, Elizabeth, when they show up confidently, no matter who their audience is, right? So that's what I would suggest.
So important. So I'm going to throw in a question that I didn't give you guys in advance, but I know that you're ready and able to respond. I'm sure, you know, you all saw the onslaught of DEI statements after the murder of George Floyd. And based on my conversations with people across the sector, some of that was window dressing, and some organizations have really used it and leveraged it as a way to begin to have conversations, not just conversations, because I feel like we've been having a lot of conversations for several decades, but, you know, how do you begin to make restitution and reconciliation? So I would love to hear your thoughts on, you know, how can organizations that made these commitments actualize those commitments in practice so that the lived experience of BIPOC folks, Latinx folks really feels different, looks different materially and emotionally, which is a lot, I know.
Yeah, I think that you know, obviously the experience of you know, 2 summers ago and everything that the city and the state and the country experienced in terms of for justice for obviously what was, you know, the murder of another Black man by law enforcement was an important moment. Not just because it was, we're talking about a human life here, but because it was an opportunity for us to really galvanize behind a shared vision for what the future of you know, lots of businesses stood up and said, you know, we want to support this, we want to do it this way. And there's you know, a number of different opinions about whether or not there was, you know, real value statements being made by any of these organizations. But I think the opportunity is on us as leaders in our sector, as leaders in other communities, to really hold them to account, right? If a company says they're going to do this and they're going to make this statement or this financial commitment to this particular community, then we need to hold them to it, and not allow for the moment to die. Because that is what often happens. Everyone gets exhausted. This has been 19 straight months of endless exhaustion, and it's And needless to say, people just want to move on in many ways. We have to really continue to utilize the moment as a moment that we can create real change. One example of that was, and this is something that we have been working on for some time, but it grew further out of this moment as we developed a project called the New York City Inclusive Growth Initiative. It's funded by the Ford Foundation, the Robin Hood Foundation, JP Morgan Chase, and we partnered with the Association for Neighborhood Housing and Development and Regional Plan Association to develop what we thought was a vision for an inclusive and equitable society here in New York City. And really, it starts with the idea essentially that growth is impacted by lots of intersectional areas. We can't just have an economic development strategy. You have to have a strategy that is informed by food insecureness, infrastructure, racial and social justice issues, LGBTQ, if you're one who has disabilities, lots of other areas that will fracture someone's confidence in society. And we need to, in order for us to fully understand and realize a real equitable vision, we needed to invite diverse and emerging leaders to this discussion to help us really understand that. And as a result, we've come up with a really, I think, incredible and aggressive agenda for achieve as an equitable city that includes, lots of commitments and other things that we are asking of the business community and the city at large. And so that was our statement for how to move forward in this particular period of time. And I think it's impalpable to really realize it in a way that helps to define it for Latinx communities, larger BIPOC marginalized communities in general. And that includes, significant civic engagement in order to hold our elected leaders account as well.
And I was somewhat surprised about the speed and the hastiness with which messages were put out into the ether. And my surprise was also peppered with a tremendous amount of skepticism about what was really going to happen. And when I think about the work that I do through Big Brothers Big Sisters, there's no question that we put out a message. And the essence of our message was to serve as a platform for the very young people that we serve who identify as people of color in the city of New York. But I have to tell you, it took me a really long time, I'd say about a week and a half, relatively speaking, before I was able to articulate to my board of trustees the impact that this was having on me personally. Because it required a level of vulnerability and authenticity that I needed to wrestle with and give myself the grace to be able to deliver on. And to me, that speaks about some of the real work, which for me wasn't a choice as someone who identifies as a Black person. And so with that, I think, what's missing for me and my hope is that as corporations have put out these messages and as we look to hold them accountable, that there also is some sense of coalition building and coalescing in order to ensure collective accountability in ways that I really hope can emerge, right? I'm not seeing yet. Big Brothers Big Sisters recently published a white paper where we were calling for a mentor for all as a pledge that New York City could take on. And the call for action really was an interagency public-private sector commitment to ensure that there was this collective energy around supporting young people and having a mentor so that they could advance and build social capital as they look to become future leaders. And I'm hopeful that we can drive this systemic call to action. But I'm still left with skepticism around what our corporate anchors are going to do in this moment, not about our organization, but more generally around upholding what they've put forth through their messaging.
Elizabeth, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I think this is such an important question, and I appreciate Jose and Alicia's leadership at each of their respective organizations as well. I think one of the things I think about too is often we say, organizations, regardless of sector, public, private, corporate, think about DEI in this external sense, like we're gonna support the communities out there that are struggling, and we're gonna, help recruit the people out there that are, that need support. And often, sometimes I think organizations forget that you have people within your organization that, you need to pay attention to as well, both from a DEI recruitment, retention standpoint, but also from an education standpoint in terms of, does your staff really understand the context of this moment? Does your staff also kind of know what is happening or how their peers are doing? And so I would just add, I wish there was more conversation about how companies and nonprofits, and I know it's not easy, everyone's at, capacity, but I think it is important for organizations to remember that people are people, both within your organizations as well as externally. That's the only thing I would add.
That's such a good point, Elizabeth. The reason this question was kind of on my mind is I had the privilege to hear Kimberly Crenshaw talk about the pushback against critical race theory. And she said something that completely blew me away. And I'm going to paraphrase here, but she said, DEI work is actually the least that you can do. That's the floor. Because what you really need to be doing is rearranging who has power and who has access to resources, right? And so I think about all of the safe ways we engage in this work without really having to risk anything or sacrifice anything or share power or decision-making or leadership. And I think I was reading that BIPOC organizations, have the capacity to raise like 24% less than organizations led by white leaders, right? And so philanthropy has an idea about who can lead and who can manage resources and money. I was talking to someone involved in executive search, and they had decided to eliminate all the candidates who had not led an organization with a portfolio of $20 million or more. And I said, Alicia and I are in a circle of sister CEOs, right? And maybe 4 or 5 of the 27 of us are leading organizations at that level. So you've basically said, like, all of the preparation and all of the sweat equity that leaders of color invest in this sector. 80% of the New York nonprofit workforce, I think the last time I checked, is people of color. And 80% of that 80% are women of color, right? So yeah, we have a lot of work to do in this area for sure. Go ahead.
Just to jump in, Danielle, I mean, that's just a really daunting point that you just shared. And, this idea of what circles of wealth perpetuating this impoverished mentality is hindering, right? I mean, I've recently heard, rather than referring to us as the public sector and the nonprofit sector, why not refer to us as the social profit sector, right? Irrespective of your mission. And truly what we're looking to generate is social capital, which can be measured that way. So,
I think one of the biggest life lessons I had was leading an organization where we did have staff who had worked there 10, 20, in some cases 30 years, who still qualified for public assistance, right? Which flies in the face of this narrative about BIPOC folks not wanting more for themselves or their families. So even when you are working to address the issues that impact your community, we're going to make sure that you're not compensated fairly and earning a living wage. Well, y'all know I could go on and on about equity in the sector. So, I feel like a lot of what we're seeing around immigration policy and practice right now is really embedded in anti-Black and quite frankly, anti-Latinx sentiment. And we know the statistics, though, that I think by 2050, the Latinx community will be a majority in the United States. How do you think that shift in the demographics of our country is going to impact how we experience democracy? One of the things I caution people is that white supremacy does not need a majority to show up as itself, right? And we can look through throughout the Caribbean and Latin America and lots of other places to see the impact that colonialism has had on our communities. But, what are your hopes, at least, for the ways in which democracy could be evolved as a result of that growth?
I'm glad to start. I think we are not a monolithic people, right? Latinx people are an incredibly diverse people. We are not a race, we are an ethnicity. And so one of my greatest hopes is that with the emergence of the Latinx community, what will also surface is an appreciation for our diversity, and that then be translated into policy and practice, right? Diverse by our history in this country, because while we are a significant segment of new Americans, we've had generations of Latinx people since the inception of this country. I mean, you look at the Northwest coast down to the Gulf of Mexico, and that's Aslan, as far as I'm concerned. Diversity by country of origin, by race, by gender identity, affluence, influence. And my greatest hope and commitment is to ensure that we continue to drive practice that responds to that diversity within the Latinx community. We must.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think the challenge often in terms of the description of our community has often been that it's one singular voice, and we act and respond in that one singular way. And there's an incredible amount of issues that each one of our countries of origin bring into the story, right? And there's a reason why the Latin population that exists in this country is darker, right, than that in certain areas of or countries or islands that they come from. Puerto Ricans themselves, 67% of Puerto Ricans identify as Caucasian. Now, that is specifically on the island itself. But you come to New York City and you see an incredibly different group of Puerto Ricans, right? They are brown, black. They're also white as well. And that brings in a lot of different biases even within the community itself. I think we have to unpack those. We have to address those concerns that have existed within our communities, not just particularly in Puerto Rican, but the larger Latino community. And we have to address it in such a way that eventually leads to a place where we can build economic and political power. The majority number, to me, is not the issue itself. We have to spend some time really pooling resources, understanding what our value structures are, what we share, what we can align ourselves around, and in the long term build the political significance that is going to allow for us to have the type of representation and future that we want for ourselves and for our families. And I think that is not just the case within the community itself, but that also is something that we need to address with other communities of color that we will often ally with specific reasons, but then in other cases maybe don't stand up and support them on really important ones. You have obviously the Black Lives Matter movement, want to ensure that people of color, of all colors, stand up and address that particular concern and say, this is something that is not specifically important to just Black communities, but this is important to me as a Latin person, as somebody who's an Asian person, as a white person. When we saw issues that occurred with communities of Asian descent, PI communities in New York City, we need to have Black and Latino populations standing up and supporting them as well, and addressing the shared concerns that we all have together. So I think political significance is going to happen in the long term, but we need to really address some of these fractured issues that we are currently experiencing in order to make a strong impact on our economic future.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I make no assumptions about the majority number in terms of, what that means if we don't really, get civically engaged, if we don't prepare emerging leaders, if we don't take care of each other, if we don't learn our history alongside our, fellow people of color and work in coalition and create alliances and build the country that we want to see, it's not going to happen. And so I couldn't agree more with what's already been said.
Great. So, the emergence of this terminology, people of color, BIPOC communities, kind of has like, these are the white folks and this is like everybody else in all of our splendor and diversity. But why is allyship and coalition building among communities of color so critical to advancing some of the issues that we've all talked about?
I'll start. I think it's certainly critical and essential as we think about being able to access and leverage resources, being able to build coalition. But what I want to lift up is that this idea of allyship across communities of color is not new, right? Recognizing the history of the Latinx community in this country, what's really clear is that there have always been associations that have often aligned across race affinity and have therefore been more inclusive than not, right? I think about Latinos who identify as Asian and the coalitions that were built in those ways. I think about Latinos who in the 18th century, well, 1800s, 19th century, were coming together in places like New York City, right? Like Afro-Cuban activism and intellectual history lived at the intersection of African-American history and thought, especially in New York City. People like Albizu Campos and Arturo Schomburg, who were real pioneers in this space. And so I want to let go that this is a novel idea and rather one that has had demonstrated impact at various points in history, and one that this is the moment where we need to look back and recognize what was possible and leverage that for what continues to be possible for us.
That's so important because I tell people this all the time. There's really nothing new under the sun. It's all really been done before. Elizabeth?
Yeah, and I also think that I was thinking about your question with respect to allyship and why it's so important. And I think a lot of it also has to do with the fact that we have been pitted against each other. I say we as like people of color, right? Like there's like the resources and then there's like the resources for us. And it all of a sudden we, historically there has just been this multiple narratives about, the different communities that we've made. There's been a vested interest in making sure that we're kind of separated and pitted against each other. And so I think if we're not united and we don't have allyship, we're going to continue those narratives, which is not going to get us anywhere.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I couldn't agree more with both Alicia and Elizabeth there. So I think it's fundamentally important for our long term, I think for us to make significant change in our country's future, we have to continue to come together in ways that we have, and we also have to find new ways to that we haven't been able to achieve in the past because we didn't have specific resources at our disposal. And I do think that this is a great moment. I think it's a moment where there is new opportunities in terms of funding and support to support our growth. There's opportunities around amplification and new media sources that we've garnered the respect of and the interest in our particular issues and our plight. And then there's a new generation of young people who will not wait for another time for this to happen and feel very adamant that this must occur now. And I think those are all the more reason why it's critically important for us to just keep our foot on the pedal and show alliances. Danielle, early on during the Black Lives Matter movement, a number of us circulated a letter, and we wrote a letter, and you signed on to that. And that letter that was one from people of color, leaders of color in particular, to really address the concerns. And we just need to continue to come together during these types of moments and show our allegiance to the larger cause, which is really push forward the voice and the concerns of everywhere.
So I think last week was Latina Pay Equity Day. And I posted something on LinkedIn that completely blew my mind. Basically, it explained that Latinas will need to wait 200 more years to achieve pay parity. And I felt like, I think the thing that's different from my mother's generation of activists, like we're doing this so our kids have a better tomorrow. Today's activists want to be the beneficiaries of their activism, right? Like, why should we wait? Why should I wait till I have grandchildren to experience some level of equity? But can we unpack a little bit around this idea that our labor is less valued? And, how can we make sure that people don't have to wait 200 years for pay parity? I mean, my short answer is write the check.
I think that sounds right to me, Danielle. There's no question, write the check. But I think that so often on the ascent, and particularly on the ascent to leadership, I think about emerging leaders. It's the role that feels like the reward, and the agency and the leadership and the accountability and responsibility that comes with it. And I would urge us to use this moment to continue to leverage that we live in a capitalist society. The paycheck matters too. And it matters because of your earning potential, not just now, but into the future. And so the question is, how do we move from, really begin to move into the social profit mindset that really brings worth and value to the contributions, right? That can be monetized in ways that the accountability, leadership, and responsibility alone are not.
And, just based on my own experience, right, I've seen some of my white counterparts get all kinds of like lifetime health insurance, tier 1. I've seen people walk away with apartments in New York City. I've seen people walk away with all of their student debt wiped clean. And so, one of my soapboxes, and Alicia, I have a lot of soapboxes, is this idea that I want to eliminate negotiations, right? Because when I have to negotiate, I'm basically trying to figure out, so I think employers have, how much can I get away with paying you? Which is a very different question from what's your value, what's your worth, right? And so I feel like people of color in particular are disadvantaged if no one else in your family or immediate social circle has had the experience of trying to negotiate an executive contract, then you're really hoping that that board is going to prioritize your needs, your value, your worth. And Alicia, I think you said it correctly, right? We have historically seen the role itself as the reward.
Right.
I thank God for the young people who work in the sector now who are just basically like, yes, sis, I got student loans. You got to pay me what you owe me.
I think there's, I was just going to say that I think that there's a sense of, imposter syndrome, right? Like there's a feeling that, I don't fully belong in the room. And as a result of that, to your, it's just like, I'm so happy to just be here. Right. And no, our value is significantly greater, and you have to be knowledgeable about that. So I think it's to the point that you referenced, Danielle, around, for sure, not having as many peers or having come from that experience feeds into that imposter syndrome, not just with walking in and negotiating your salary, but in a lot of other ways, right? There's just generally being invited into discussions that are important and you in a position of significance. But we have great value to contribute, not just people, but as individual leaders have done the work and have garnered the respect of so many others. And I think carrying that into a discussion is can be difficult given the circumstances and given each one of our individual experiences. But I talk about this often around really ensuring that the nonprofit sector or the social profit sector, as you referenced, Alicia, which I might
Yeah, I have to write that down, Alicia.
Let's put it out there.
Yeah, now we need to know our value as a sector. We're often called with philanthropy, with corporate leaders, with other folks to share our expertise and share our ideas and our vision for what any piece of work we do, and are often not compensated for that contribution that we're making. Whereas the for-profit sector and corporations are they're considered consultants and they're compensated for that contribution. We need to treat ourselves as a sector, as a community, as individuals, as having that same exact value.
You touched upon something that I just wanted to raise, and I definitely have grappled with this myself, and that is imposter syndrome. Mm-hmm. Right? Do I belong in the room? Am I good enough to be here? And feeling that sense of like, do I belong? Do I have a role to play in this space? Well into my career. I think I didn't let go of some of that stuff until I hit that half-century mark, which is only 2 years ago. So how have you guys kind of handled imposter syndrome, if you've ever been challenged by that? And what would you advise to other folks coming up now who are trying to center themselves?
I have definitely experienced that. I still do. I think I think about this a lot because it's easy to kind of psych yourself out. And as someone who, always wants to grow and learn, it's like, yes, I'm open to like being the better version of myself. But that also doesn't mean I'm not ready for like what I have in front of me today. And so one of the ways that I have been trying to work on this is to have people who I trust and love and know me, but who can also give me like feedback, right? So when I get real feedback, then I'm like, okay, so like this is a thing I can do better at. Take that, own that, but also hear all the positive things that these people are saying about you and all the positive things that the people that you work with really closely care about you. And so that can take the form of like, personal friends and family, but also like coworkers who I trust and who I'm like, okay, I'm going to take what they say for face value because I trust them and I know that they're going to give me honest feedback. And so having that balance of like, be confident that you're here because you are doing well in what you do, your stuff. Everyone has room for growth, right? No one's perfect. Everyone has room for growth. And so feeling and knowing that you're enough is like really important to ground me. And that happens through like honest coworkers and mentors that can give me real-time feedback and help me get out of my head a little bit.
Yeah, I think we're always growing, and I think everyone experiences this, regardless of your experience at some point in your career. I think that it's further compounded, unfortunately, by a number of factors that we all bring into this conversation tonight. Am I the only person of color in the room? Am I the only room? There's a number of different reasons why it may just be further heightened or amplified. And then you might continue to have to deal with it for a more extensive period of time as a result. But you're in the room, and we're in the room because weren't just simply got a misplaced invitation, right? Like we're there because of our experience and everything that we bring into the discussion. And so it's about capitalizing on that moment and adding real value.
I think one of the things that for me, it's been less about imposter syndrome. I feel oftentimes I've felt a sense of entitlement around being in certain spaces. That's right. I earned this seat. It is mine. But what I have experienced has been a heightened awareness around my limited access. right? And that has been something that I've had to wrestle with, whether it's been in conversation about topics or experiences that I've not had and that are not within my reach. And I think recently, and to your point, Danielle, it's something that I've recently become comfortable with is leaning into my limited access and using that as a lever for conversation for my personal growth and understanding. And I think the other piece that really has been spotlighted for me is that there seem to be these blueprints for leadership and expectations for the ways in which we mainstream expectations for the ways in which we ought to travel or traverse on this path and ascent towards leadership. And what's become increasingly clear is that there is no blueprint for my leadership.
That part.
I've had to make it up and make it up in a way that is authentic and genuine and reflective of my values and reflective of my commitment and my very essence. And that's all right and comfortable and is what fuels my confidence in sitting in my seat.
Hey, Chris Rivera. Love it. Former staff member. Good to see you. I got distracted. I was so excited. So what kind of advice would you give, not just to your younger self, but we got to look out for our Oliver babies too. So what kind of advice would you give to some of to your younger self and also to our Oliver scholars as they think about their own leadership trajectories?
I'll start us off and say I'll give them Alicia's advice. You earn this seat. You take up that space. I'm going to channel that myself. I think going into whether it's your first job or maybe it's scholars going into college or new scholars going into high school, to have an asset mindset instead of like a deficit mindset, to know that you bring a lot to the table. That you've done a lot to get to where you are already that has prepared you for whatever is next. And so be confident and patient with that process.
That's good sound advice.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I would also say that, Oliver and, the different educational experiences that we come up as a result of the Oliver program provide incredible networks and resources. Continue to leverage all of those as much as possible. Your network is what will help your growth in addition to your hustle and your heart and everything that you contribute to the work. So really ensure that you are continuing to be a part of communities that are a reflection of yourself and your needs and your interests and your background, and also I would say is give more than asking. I think I spent a long time over the course of my career just trying to just give to as many folks that I found that we had shared common professional experiences and give to folks that I wanted to learn from, as opposed to continually asking from them. And it pays off in the long term because those individuals are willing to be helpful to you and support you and continue to support your growth if they feel like there is a mutually beneficial relationship and it's not purely transactional. So make sure that you're supporting individuals' growth as much as you're asking for it.
First, I would start by thanking her because she was if I think about my 21-year-old self, that woman was fierce. She was a revolutionary. I am the much tamer version of who Alicia was at 21. I got into a lot of good trouble, let's put it that way. But what I would tell her is that everything will work out. Everything will happen as it's supposed to happen. To your Oliver scholars, and I think back about to my path, and it's not dissimilar. I was also an independent school student and attended a college that will likely be one of the schools that's a top choice for a number of the Oliver scholars. And I just want to echo what's already been said, Elizabeth, your point about seeking feedback, receiving feedback. Feedback is a gift. And so I encourage you to seek it, to embrace it, and not only to seek it in safe spaces, but to seek it in spaces that are not. And just, furthering, Jose, your comment is build those cabinets, personal cabinets for yourself, right? And this is an evolving process. I'm still building my personal cabinet, and that shifts depending on the stage that I'm in, the space that I'm in, or what I'm looking to test out and speak in first draft about, right? I'm cautious about my audience, but it's important that we bring intention to building those mentoring relationships that will be with you for some time.
Thank you so much. I think that one of the things that has helped me is that I'm always striving to be as advertised. And I thought about that the first time a few years ago when I had given a talk and someone came up to me afterwards and she said, I hope working for you is as good as it sounds. Based on your comments. So, I went back to my office and I was like, well, give me the tea. And I think more often than not, I just try to show up as my authentic self. Now, on the one hand, sometimes that doesn't work for everybody, and learning to be okay with that and not to internalize it as defining your whole journey. I'm not for everybody, but I'm for somebody. And sometimes, that's going to have to be enough. So I don't know if we have any questions from the audience. Thank you to everybody out there on Facebook who's joining us. We really appreciate your presence. And I am just so elated and honored that Jose, Elizabeth, and Alicia, you agreed to be part of this conversation. I do think, that it is so important for not just our Latinx students at Oliver, obviously, but for all of our kids to really see leaders who don't look like, what people are necessarily expecting. I can remember going out to a high school when I was in another organization, and the kids just couldn't believe that there was a Black person in charge of the organization. And so I think you can dream bigger when you have a sense of what's possible, and hopefully a lot of those young people will exceed anything that I've been able to accomplish in my time, for sure. So thank you for joining us. Happy birthday, Oliver is coming up next week. So please follow us on Oliver Scholars Facebook page and celebrate this amazing legacy and help us keep it going. One of the reasons that I am so passionate about the work at Oliver, like Alicia and like everybody else, I didn't have an Oliver, but I had a mama. And so I did go to an independent school, and we do have a couple of Oliver Scholars at my college alma mater. But I think, Black and Latino kids, and we are very intentional about the mission, are significantly less likely to be even referred for gifted education. And the number one reason, teacher bias. They just don't look into our kids' faces and see the awesome brilliance and possibility that's out there. And so there is so much going on in the world that needs addressing. I want all hands on deck, and I want all those hands to be equipped to lead in ways that matter. So thank you again for joining us, and everybody have a great evening. I appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle.